Joining me today is the editor of Spiked Online and a true free speech warrior, Brendan O'Neill. Finally, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hi, Dave.
I've been trying to get you for like a year and a half. You are not on Twitter. What kind of human in 2017, public person, editor, is not
I hate
on Twitter?
I hate Twitter. I think it's become incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be a tool of free speech where you could express yourself and say what you think, and maybe even a space on the internet for people who have different, crazy or alternative views. But in many ways, it's become the opposite. It's become a tool for shutting down free speech. You know, the whole Twitch hunt phenomenon, Twitter mobs, anyone who thinks outside of the kind of mainstream liberal PC box can be hounded quite easily.
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of Twitter. Also, I have a short temper, just to warn you.
So then you're really doing the right thing.
So I don't think I'd be suited to Twitter because I would end up getting into arguments I didn't want to get into.
Yeah, for a free speech guy and an absolutist in this regard, the mobs and all that, and the Twitch policing and all of that, you're for them doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
You're not for stopping them doing those things. You're just talking about the process of everyone doing all the stuff you don't like.
It's a difficult one because you don't want any clampdown or restrictions on their right to be a mob, right?
Yeah.
You want to defend the right to form a mob and to say things as a mob. But it does have an impact on freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And it's a point John Stuart Mill makes on Liberty. John Stuart Mill often argued that the worst kind of censorship is not necessarily legal or state censorship. It's often what he called the informal tyranny of custom, where there's just this expectation that you will go along with the conformist mainstream view. And if you don't, you will in some subtle way be punished, maybe ousted from polite society, maybe a signal will be sent that you're not a good person. I think the Twitter mob phenomenon feeds into that. So in many ways, it can be a more insidious form of censorship than even government censorship. Yeah,
it's so interesting because I say all the time now, it's that at the moment, and of course this can change, but at the moment, I'm not that concerned about government censorship. At the moment. That being said, what I am concerned about is that we're silencing ourselves really because everyone is afraid of the outrage machine. And that's why I've tried to consistently bring on people like you who, although you're not on Twitter, who are just out there doing it, and you're still alive. And as Douglas Murray said to me, the water ain't that cold. You know,
That's exactly
get out
right.
there and do it.
Yeah, I think the worst kind of censorship now is self-censorship. Almost cowardice is a strong word, but I think with some people it's a cowardice about saying what they really think. With other people, it's a genuine fear that if they say what they think, they will be hounded or demonized and so on. Self-censorship is the real danger now, and there's a lot of it going on. People who are not speaking freely and openly because they fear the consequences, and the consequences can be quite severe. You can have your workplace hounded with emails saying you should sack this guy because he thinks A, B, or C. Of course, you can be hounded off campus by informal gangs of feminists or PC people or even trans people. Yeah. The government has no involvement in that, but it does nonetheless have this very insidious, profound impact on the general freedom of society and the general sense that everything should be sayable, everything should be debatable, everything should be up for discussion. That idea is being demolished not by government jackboots, but increasingly by these informal gangs of PC enforcers.
Yeah, where do you think that the companies themselves, the tech companies, so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., what responsibility do they have? Because everyone knows they have their own terms of service. We're putting this on YouTube. Nobody's forcing me to be on YouTube. Nobody's forcing me to be on Twitter. Again, you're not on Twitter, a wise man. But what responsibility related to free speech do you think they have? Because they've booted off some people that I think are actually decent. I'm not talking about some of the people that are actually making death threats, which of course is a legal issue, but they've put some people like Sargon of Akkad, who I've had on my show a couple times, they've booted him off Twitter.
I think they have a large responsibility in relation to freedom of speech. And there was a Supreme Court case in this country decades ago about corporate towns, which are these towns built up around corporations and so on. And one of these corporate towns, or a few of these corporate towns, argued that they didn't have to adhere to the First Amendment because they were private entities. And the judgment that was made in the Supreme Court case was that if you are a private enterprise, which is so large that you legitimately incorporate a huge amount of public space, a huge amount of the public sphere in which people speak and in which people interact, then you do actually have a responsibility to defend freedom of speech. And I think that certainly goes for social media companies.
Yeah,
because
that's interesting.
That's now that's now a public arena. That's if you look at Facebook, like a seventh of humanity is on Facebook, or Twitter, millions of people on Twitter, millions and millions of people on YouTube. These are the new public forums. These are the new public squares. These are the new spaces in which people stand up, make pronouncements, get on soapboxes, hand out pamphlets, engage their fellow citizens. So I think it's entirely legitimate to expect that the same free speech that we hope would apply in a public square would apply in these forums too.
So is there a little bit of a problem there, because we're going to talk about your Marxist libertarian views in a little bit, but as someone that, at least going off the second part of that, the libertarian side, I know for me, the idea of having the government come in and now tell Facebook and YouTube what to do, even though I have my frustrations with them, I don't really see that as the answer here. What I see as the answer is capitalism and competition, and let other companies come and hopefully, give a little competition, so they have to give us a better service. But I struggle with this one, and interestingly, I see a lot of people on the right who are supposed to be the libertarians and the limited government guys calling for these places to be regulated, sort of like they did to AT&T years ago.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because on the one hand, you don't want the government to tell these social media companies to prevent people from saying certain things, which is happening in Britain at the moment. Lots of politicians are kind of ganging together to force Twitter and other forums to restrict certain things, hate speech and so on. So you don't want that. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily want the government to force these companies to preserve freedom of speech or to publish things that they might not want to publish as a private organization. So it is difficult, there's no question about that. But my preference would be that we would encourage these kind of companies and encourage social media platforms to value freedom of speech in its entirety, which means freedom of speech not only for people who we like and who are agreeable and who are interesting and sensible and liberal and nice and so on, but also for people who are edgy and difficult and controversial and contrarian and maybe even hateful, on the basis that it's only by having the fullest freedom of expression possible that we can all then work out what we think is right and wrong. That's the only possibility of arriving at any kind of truth, where everything is up for grabs, everything is stated publicly, and then you trust the audience, you trust the viewers, you trust the listeners to decide for themselves, using their autonomous minds, what's good and what's bad. That's the kind of culture we need to cultivate.
Yeah, is there a doubly difficult problem here, because also we don't know what's going on with the algorithms that these companies make? So publicly they could say we're for free speech, we're for all these things, but actually they might be writing in code that could, stop some of my subscribers from seeing videos, or putting me aside could, wipe out people's Twitter accounts or whatever else. It's like, we actually don't know now the math behind how people get information.
Unquestionably, that happens, and I don't have a Twitter account, but I sometimes look at Twitter. You can't live in the modern sphere without looking at it and seeing what people are talking about on there. And what amazes me, if you look at Twitter stories, for example, or the things that Twitter emphasizes, it's always stuff that goes along with the Twitter mindset, with the Silicon Valley mindset, with that kind of fairly mainstream conformist mindset now. They emphasize if Twitter has a kind of intersectional outburst and it attacks someone for being sexist or misogynist or racist and so on, often overblown accusations, Twitter will emphasize that, upfront it, and turn it into the daily story. So Twitter undoubtedly has an editorial input and control, and in a sense you want to say, fine, you can do that, but then they've got to stop calling themselves the free speech wing of the free speech party, because increasingly they do appear like a publication which just happens to let other voices chip in every now and then.
So basically what I'm sensing from you is that there really is no good answer here yet, right? Because what you're saying is you want them to self-police, you don't want the government to come in, you want them to be transparent, but you don't want to use force to make that happen. Right. So there really is no answer that we can walk away from and be like, well, all right, that's the sensible way to deal with it.
There's
the idea that you're talking about that I like, the personal responsibility of the individual and the company. But that's sort of separate from what actually happens when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, there's no easy answer, except that we should defend freedom of speech every single time it's under attack, whether that's in the academy, on some informal part of campus, in relation to the government, in social media, in the press. wherever freedom of speech is under attack, we should defend freedom of speech, and we should defend it for the very simple reason that everyone should be allowed to say what they want to say, and everyone else, this is the part of freedom of speech that people forget, because they always say, oh, you're defending free speech for horrible people. The second, even more important part of freedom of speech is defending the right of the audience to decide for themselves what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the most important part, because the problem with censorship, of course, is that it infantilizes people. It tells you, you don't have to think. We will think for you. We will decide for you. And that really weakens people's moral muscles, weakens their intellectual muscles, encourages them to be childlike and infant-like and to never think about the world.
Yeah, it directly feeds outrage culture, actually.
It feeds a very simplistic reading of the world, a very childish reading of the world, and it dumbs down culture. Censorship is a far greater threat to intellectualism and peace and liberty and all those things we think are good than freedom of speech ever could be. So it's important to always defend freedom of speech in every sphere, and through doing that, I think we might eventually encourage people rather than forcing them to protect freedom of speech within the spheres in which they operate.
Yeah. Do you think we're getting some wins right now? I mean, you're doing a tour with a bunch of people from Brett Weinstein and Laura Kipnis and Steven Pinker and a whole bunch of people in this space. And, you know, I'm doing the college thing too. And obviously Spiked is working, this show is working, other people in this space, it's all working. Do you think we're actually starting to win here? I'm hopeful as a human.
Yeah.
You know, I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
Otherwise I couldn't do this. But there's so much bad stuff, it's hard to place it.
I veer between optimism and pessimism, and which are both valuable emotions as it happens. Optimism is good because you feel buoyant and you want to go out and fight in the world, and pessimism is good because it makes you reflect and think, well, what's going wrong? So I don't have a problem with either of those takes, but I flip between the two. On the one hand, I'm optimistic because I see lots of young people, and on this tour that Spiked is doing, the Unsafe Space tour, where we're going to campuses, and what we're trying to do, in fact, is move away from the pantomime debates that have been taking place on campus in recent years, where some member of the so-called alt-right will come in and irritate all the feminists and the idiots in the audience, and then they will, you know, the alt-right gets a kick because they wind everyone up, and then the audience members get a kick because they get to shout fascist at people they don't like.
Right, and then all you do is strengthen the extremes.
You strengthen the extremes, and it's all heat and no light. And it's entertaining, and everyone watches it on YouTube, and it gets hundreds of thousands of hits, but no one learns anything. So what we're trying to do with this tour is go onto campuses and convince people, using hopefully intellectual rigor and substantial historical arguments and clever people, that freedom of speech is the most important value in a civilized society. And in fact, civilized society is not possible without it. So we're trying as best as we can to lift the discussion away from the rather pantomime black and white unhelpful clash that it's become, the culture war that it's become, to explain the origins of freedom and the importance of freedom. And I'm optimistic because we're having a good reception. And I'm meeting young people in New York and Washington and other places in America who are really, really keen on freedom of speech, but feel like they don't have a place in which they can say how keen they are on freedom of speech. Yeah. So I'm optimistic in that sense. I'm pessimistic in the sense that I fear that the argument for freedom is being colonized by people on the right who I don't think are always 100% convincing in their defense of freedom. And the thing that particularly worries me now is the left's abandonment of the ideal of freedom. I think that's actually the real crisis we face in Western societies now, which is that the left and so-called liberals, and you know the word liberal is about the word liberty, are turning their backs on liberty. That's a real problem. Yeah, okay, so I really want to dive deep into this one, because everyone watching this, at least my audience, knows that this is where I've spent most of my time. You know, I came from the progressive world. I wanted to fix the left. Subsequently, 2 years later, after endlessly talking about this, I did a video with PragerU, which they titled "Why I Left the Left," because I've come to the position that liberalism, in the classical sense, the John Stuart Mill sense, no longer has anything to do with modern leftism. Yeah. So let's really go deep on this. So first off, let's start with the roots of why
liberalism should be connected to the left? Let's just start there.
Well, the way I put it is that I didn't leave the left left me, because the left abandoned everything that it used to represent. And the way I see political correctness, which is this kind of rehabilitation of the racial imagination, so everyone is now black and white or man and woman, in this constant divisiveness and shoving people back into biological boxes from which they spend 200 years trying to escape. Or it's illiberalism, so it doesn't want you to be controversial or daring or contrarian, it wants everything to be sedate. Or even the modern PC people's agitation with things like economic growth or exploring nature, or even, dare I say it, exploiting nature for the good of mankind. On all those,
that one can get you in some extra trouble. Yeah.
I mean, that's super controversial.
Yeah.
All those things suggest to me that the PC culture, you know, people call it left. In my mind, it runs counter to everything the left used to stand for. I think it is reactionary. I think if anything, it's right-wing. I happen to think left and right aren't particularly useful categories now, but it's certainly more right-wing than it is left-wing.
Do you remember a moment when it happened? Because that's what a lot of people ask me. They ask me when my specific wake-up was, or when your specific wake-up was. But do you think there was a cultural or political moment that really was the hammer that kind of whacked it and then started it going the wrong way?
I think it's been a long-standing process. I think it's been growing for a long time. I think you could even trace it back to the 60s, when the left shifts from being interested in economic issues and the working class towards being interested in, you know, the new left, interested in cultural issues and the problem of advertising and consumerism and so on. And that shift from being interested in production, how are things produced and who owns them, towards being obsessed with consumerism. Why are we always pressured to buy things and so on? And that was a very important shift from economy and power towards issues of culture. And then that grows through the 70s and the 80s, and it becomes the dominant theme of the left. And you know, the way I see it is, if I look back, because I still call myself a Marxist libertarian, I partly do it just to...
We're going to unpack that.
I partly do it just to annoy people, because no one understands what it means. Even I don't understand what it means. But I always considered the left to be universal, pro-growth, that was one of the most important parts of the left, and interested in autonomy, interested in pushing away all the priests and princes and bureaucrats who wanted to tell ordinary people how to live, and trusted ordinary people more than experts. That's how I saw the left. Now I see a left, a so-called left, that has abandoned those three things. So it's ditched universalism in favor of the rabbit hole of identity politics and the rabbit hole of biological difference or historical difference. It's ditched the argument for economic growth in favor of the cult of environmentalism and this idea that every single thing we do to the planet is destructive and maybe we should rein in growth and have less growth. And it's ditched the argument for autonomy and the shoving aside of the bureaucrats who want to govern ordinary people's lives in favor of sacralizing expertise and celebrating the state and the role of the state in governing or assisting poor people who apparently can't cope on their own. So if those are the three spheres of left-wing politics, and I think they are, which is universalism, economic growth in order to liberate people from poverty, and the idea that people can probably run their own lives and will make a better fist of it than government would, I think that's what the left used to be about. Going back 100 years, 150 years, they've ditched all of that and are now very pro-state, pro-identity, pro-division, and pro-planet over pro-growth. That is what worries me. So that's why I say I didn't leave the left. I still consider myself a man of the radical left. It's the left that has drifted off into a whole new territory.
And that's why whatever it is that we are, whatever that is, that thing, and I don't even know all your political beliefs on everything, but I'm sure we have some disagreement with those. But whatever it is that we basically are is becoming the widest tent. Because I see what's happening right now, and it's like we're taking in people all over the map that are just going, I just want to live free. That's
you know, this is the exciting thing about the period we live in. This is where I am optimistic, and I'm generally very optimistic about where politics is going, even though it goes up and down and up and down. You know, I still consider myself a little bit of a Trotskyist. Right now, and the reason, when I say this to right-wing friends of mine and kind of classical liberal friends of mine, they look at me in absolute horror. And then I say to them, look, Trotsky was once asked, what does it mean to be a radical leftist? And he said it means you want to increase the power of man over nature and decrease the power of man over man. Now, I would live and die by that.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That is what
I'm with you.
I
All
want.
right.
I want to increase our control of nature so that we understand it better and we use it better in order to end poverty and so on, it's particularly in the third world. And I want to decrease the power of man over man. Fewer laws, fewer regulations, no censorship, no bureaucracy or far less bureaucracy. So when I say that to classical liberals and right-wing friends of mine, they get it instantly.
Yeah.
But what's really exciting about today is that I actually think the new alliances that are forming are incredibly interesting. So I often find I have far more in common, even with people on the alt-right, or certainly with people on the kind of classical liberal right or the free market right, than I do with people who today describe themselves as left-wing. I have more in common with the religious people in Europe who are currently defending freedom of speech far better than some atheists are, because religious speech is under attack in Europe. So it's the new alliances that I find incredibly interesting and exciting. And so I think a new dividing line is opening up. And it's no longer the dividing line between where do you stand on the market, or are you left-wing or right-wing. It's increasingly a dividing line over, do you trust ordinary people to run their own lives? And that sounds like a simple question, but actually it cuts to the heart of everything. Because if you do trust ordinary people to run their own lives, you will be interested in diminishing government interference, defending free speech in all instances, because you think people can make up their own minds, and diminishing bureaucracy. If you don't trust ordinary people, and tragically the left doesn't anymore, you will be in favour of growing the welfare state, growing environmental controls, restricting the expansion of production and growth and everything else, and censoring speech. So the key dividing line, I think now, is, do you trust people? Yes or no? It's
such an interesting distinction you're making there, because the left, if you were just looking at this sort of from higher up down, what the messaging is, it's sort of like, you know, you're screwed, you're the little man, and, you know, so we really care about you. But what they're really saying is, give us power to control you. These are two very different things. And that's why I think so much of what's happening with postmodernism and intersectionality and all of this is just lazy thinking. It sounds good at first, like, oh, we're going to give more money to poor people, or we're going to, you know, if you're oppressed in this way, you should link together with someone who's oppressed in this way. It all sounds kind of like it makes sense. But when you get to that second layer, it starts peeling away pretty freaking quick.
This is the really shocking thing about the left today. The left is now a movement against working class people. And that is a turnaround in politics which I think is historically unprecedented. The left used to be a movement for working class people, which meant that it understood them, or it sought to understand them. It wanted to know what they thought. It wanted to increase their power and increase their autonomy and increase their income. That's what the left was born to do, and that's what it devoted itself to doing for decades. Increasingly, what the left represents now is it's a movement against working people. So in Britain, on the British left, they now often refer to poor and working class people as the vulnerable. And they see them as very vulnerable people, vulnerable to being exploited, vulnerable to the harsh vagaries of everyday life, vulnerable to the spin-offs of poverty and so on. And so their argument becomes, we must protect these people, we must save these people, we must help these people. And what happens then over time is that it's less and less about liberating ordinary people, whether it's from the harshness of everyday life or from the diktats of bureaucracy, and it becomes more about mollycoddling them and building this therapeutic, bureaucratic scaffolding around every single area of their lives. And as a consequence, these people have less freedom, less choice, less sense of themselves as active citizens in the world. So everywhere I look at the left now, particularly in Britain, Western Europe and the US, I think they are having an incredibly destructive impact on ordinary people's lives. Which is why you know, I still call myself left-wing, but I'm constantly conscious of the fact that to most people out there, perfectly understandably, they think that means I'm on the wrong side. So maybe I'm fighting a losing battle because I'm trying to recover a sense of what the left used to be about.
Yeah, I completely hear you, brother. I like that you call that a bureaucratic scaffolding, because it's just this sort of fake, it's almost as if they've built this bureaucratic scaffolding on quicksand.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah.
So it's temporarily holding this stuff up and controlling you.
That's
but
right.
actually the foundation is sinking at the same time.
But you know what proved to me that the left is on the wrong side these days was Brexit. So in last year, 2016, 17.4 million British people, the largest number of British people that have ever voted for anything in history, voted against the European Union and for greater sovereignty, greater popular sovereignty, greater democratic control against the EU, which is an institution which is illiberal, undemocratic, and also racist. It has a two-tier immigration policy which allows freedom of movement for largely white Europeans, while at the same time paying African dictators to keep their people out of Europe. So this is an institution that I'm absolutely alarmed that anyone who calls themselves liberal or left-wing could support this vast Byzantine bureaucracy.
And that's exactly what they did.
That's what they did. So ordinary people, 17.4 million of them, defied the advice of the establishment. Pretty much the entire establishment was on their knees begging us to vote to stay in the European Union. They defied the establishment, they voted against this bureaucracy, and they voted by implication and sometimes explicitly in what they said to pollsters, they voted for independence, for more control over their lives, for less bureaucracy in their lives.
Right.
It was an incredibly positive moment in British history. In my view, it's the best thing that's happened in Britain in 25 years, politically speaking.
And it was framed as if it was some sort of racist,
it was
backwards,
framed, so what you have is the left instantly denounced it as racist, xenophobic, a new form of fascism. You people have been hoodwinked by demagogues. You don't know what you're doing. You're low information. This was the term they used, low information voters. Idiots, imbeciles, you stupid people, how could you do this? That, you know, there are many nails in the coffin of the left. I think their failure to understand the positive progressive component of Brexit might prove to be the final nail. Because that was a very clear instance of people doing the things that people like us would like them to do, which is take a stand against bureaucracy and speak for yourself. Be self-governing. Desire to be in control of your own life. That positive, wonderful Enlightenment idea, which informed the left for at least 100 years after the Enlightenment, and then bit by bit they kind of lost sight of it. That's what Brexit represented, and the left's response was to call us, because I voted for Brexit, was to call us fascists. That is the worst abdication of the left's historic responsibility that I can remember.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting way that they change words. I mean, they change definitions of words. Fascist.
Yeah.
You were the anti-fascist.
That's right.
Movement. You were trying to take the power away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's astonishing.
But they consistently do this.
That's astonishing. If you are in favour of freedom of speech, if you think there should be no controls on speech, if you think democracy is preferable to technocracy, if you think these things which would traditionally have been seen as anti-fascist, they will now call you a fascist. They have completely bastardised that word and use it simply as a brand to denounce people who they dislike. And you know, it's particularly pronounced in the campus culture wars, where those who defend freedom of speech most vociferously on campus are the ones who are called fascists, which is a complete reversal of what fascism is. I was at the I was in Warsaw a few weeks ago at the Museum of the History of the Jews in Poland, which is a terrible history. And what was amazing is that there's this whole room devoted to the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Jews were piled in before they were all exterminated. And what's amazing is that in the Warsaw Ghetto, they had no free speech rights, none whatsoever. The fascists, the Nazis denied them any free speech rights. And yet, these underground networks developed and magazines and newspapers emerged like mushrooms after the rain, in the words of one of these people in the Warsaw Ghetto. You know, at risk of death, they published their own magazines, they published their own newspapers in bunkers, they stored them under floorboards, they secretly sold them on the street, and they could be shot on the spot for doing this. Yeah. My view is that anti-fascism is freedom of speech. That's what it is in its entirety. Fascism is censorship. So when I hear all these Antifa people and all these anti-fascists going around demanding the censorship of people they don't like, demanding the censorship of people who they find difficult or uncomfortable, they are behaving far more like fascists. They are behaving far more like the rulers of the Warsaw Ghetto who forbade Jews from publishing magazines and newspapers than they are like anti-fascists. And in my mind, anti-fascism, by which I mean largely the left, the left was a great warrior against fascism, was entirely about defending freedom, and it was primarily about defending freedom of thought and freedom of speech.
Is the inherent problem here with the Antifa stuff is that the left, whoever the leaders are, whether it's in Britain or in the United States, that they've coddled these ideas for so long that they don't want to stand up and say to Antifa, you can't do this, because they don't want those tactics used on them.
Yes.
So when everyone's concerned about violence right now and how, you know, speech and violence are starting to meld together, I mean, Antifa is if there was one organization that is creating illegal violence in the United States the most at the moment, it's Antifa. I mean, one of the most underreported stories of last year was outside the Democratic National Committee as Hillary was being nominated. Antifa was basically burning it down. The mainstream media barely showed it. They show up to all these campuses and burn everything down and break store windows and all that. The right has its problems, and I want to get to that too, because that's where you started here. You're uncomfortable with where we've sort of been shifted to, which I think is really interesting. But part of the issue is the left can't stand up to these people because they know that they'll just take them out the way they've taken out everyone else.
Yeah, my view of Antifa is that it is absolutely the most ridiculous movement I can think of. It is obscene, in fact, because they present themselves as being in the lineage of people like George Orwell. Right. George Orwell left his incredibly comfortable life in Britain to go to Spain and fight physically against fascists and risk death. Antifa right now is actually a very bourgeois, anti-working class, anti-democratic movement which thinks being an anti-fascist means getting Uber into town and punching a working class Trump voter in the face. That is incomparable to what the international brigades did in Spain, or to what anti-fascists did in Greece during the Second World War, or to what German citizens did who secretly plotted and acted against the Nazis. For them to compare themselves to genuine anti-fascists in 20th century Europe is outrageous, in fact. This is a censorious, snobby, paternalistic, ridiculous bourgeois movement which has completely lost sight of what it means to be left-wing and completely lost sight of what it means to be anti-fascist, to the extent that they behave far more like fascists than they do anti-fascists. They are censorious, they burn things down that they find offensive, they agitate constantly to shut down meetings, they heckle people so they cannot be heard. You know who they remind me of? One of the greatest things ever written about freedom of speech was titled A Plea for Free Speech by Frederick Douglass. Former slave, of course, become abolitionist, one of my favorite figures from American history. He took part in a abolitionist meeting in Boston, and it was shut down by hecklers, pro-slavery hecklers who invaded this meeting and prevented it from taking place. Frederick Douglass was so shocked by this that he wrote A Plea for Free Speech, in which he said free speech is the most important freedom in the world, and it's the freedom that makes tyrannies tremble. It's the freedom that puts government on the back foot. It's the freedom that keeps you as a citizen free and active and puts authority back in the closet where they belong, away from us. And that was an argument against the kind of thing that Antifa is doing, which is invading meetings, preventing them from taking place, a very informal, mob-like form of censorship. So that's what they remind me of from history. They remind me of these right-wing, borderline fascistic, very questionable agitators who hated the idea of people having freedom, who hated the idea of people speaking freely and listening freely. So the idea that Antifa is in any way progressive or liberal or decent is a joke.
Yeah. All right, so to wrap this sort of whole first chunk together, I want to talk about this right part of this, because you said you're sort of uncomfortable with how this connects to the right, or where you suddenly find yourself allied.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm not uncomfortable to the extent that I can't cope with it. And one of the problems, I think, among left-wingers who are libertarian, and I include myself in that number, I think sometimes they are so terrified of being called right-wing that they actually will end up ditching their own principles. So they won't defend free speech as much as they would like to, because they know they'll be compared with Cato or Reason or some other group that they are a bit questionable about. So it's not that I'm uncomfortable to the extent that I am going to ditch my principles. I would never, ever ditch the argument for freedom of speech. I think that's the key thing everyone has to do in the 21st century. But it's simply that I think the reason the right has managed to colonize the argument for liberty today, and particularly the argument for freedom of speech, is not because they are 100% behind it. And you can see that in the way in which they will agitate against the right of Islamists to speak on campus. Or, they will be quite favorable of punishing Beyonce, for example, for doing her Black Power dance at the Super Bowl, which Breitbart got very angry about and demanded an apology for. And you think, calm down, Breitbart.
Yeah, pretty sure Beyonce doesn't do apologies.
Yeah, she doesn't do apologies, and that's great.
Yeah.
So they're not 100% on the side of freedom of speech, but the reason they can appear to be is because the left has abandoned the field. And the left has turned freedom into a dirty word. And the left has given the impression that freedom is a right-wing project. This is the great historic mistake that the left has made. It has so thoroughly abandoned the argument for freedom of speech and for liberty in general and for individual autonomy, which actually used to be a central part of radical left-wing politics going back 150 years or so. It's so thoroughly abandoned that the right can now step in and say, well, we are the masters of this argument. So the left has totally screwed things up and granted the moral high ground to people on the right.
So basically, by not playing, they've just ceded the game.
Ceded the game.
So I understand that, and I feel you're probably right in that. But what I also found at the exact same time is that as I've had my own journey here and talking to people all over the map, that I find a lot more intellectual flexibility with people on the right.
Yeah.
So if I can sit across from people that are pro-life while I'm pro-choice, or even some people that are against gay marriage and I'm gay married, or that I'm against the death penalty and that are for the death penalty, they'll at least have an intellectual argument about it, and I see much less of that on the left.
Well, the perfect example of this, I was supposed to speak at Oxford University in 2014 on abortion, and it was two men. It was me on one side making the pro-choice argument. I'm about as pro-choice as you can get. And on the other side was a right-wing man from the Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing newspaper, who was going to make the anti-choice or pro-life argument. Feminists at Oxford shut it down. They said it was unacceptable for people without uteruses, which is how they described us, which I thought was quite transphobic, to talk about biology in that way.
Should we tell people now that biologically you're a woman?
Exactly.
Would this be the right time to tell them?
Yeah, I should self-identify.
Yeah.
They threatened to shut it down. They threatened to turn up with instruments, and they didn't mean musical instruments, to prevent this debate from taking place. And Oxford, to its mortifying shame, agreed with them and prevented the debate from taking place. What that told me was that here was this right-wing guy who's very anti-choice, thinks abortion is terrible, who was willing to discuss with me, and I am incredibly pro-choice. I mean, right up to the end, because I believe in bodily individual autonomy. He was willing to have that incredibly difficult debate with me, whereas the so-called left on the campus, the so-called Oxford radicals, didn't want the debate to take place at all. So I think you're right. At the moment, on the right, there is more intellectual flexibility, there's more openness, there's more honesty. And if I was coming of political age now, I would probably go to the right. And I think that's where lots of sensible people are going, and I perfectly understand why.